Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast. The Church in Action podcast is something offered every 2 weeks or twice a month, more accurately, from Vision New England. And we have a special episode today. This is the first one where we're going to start engaging in the field of mental health. And mental health is a strategic priority for Vision New England as an organization and as a ministry. We have 100 of people that we work with across New England. We call them directors, and they set our agenda, and they've defined racial reconciliation, mental health, and addiction as all major issues the church is confronting today and our culture is confronting today. And so we want to engage in that under the auspices of our call to do justice. And we define doing justice as anything that prevents someone from living the fullness of life Jesus intends for them in this life. I've stolen that from Tim Keller, if I remember right. So don't think I'm a great theologian. Or said a different way, Dr. Emmett Price from Gordon-Conwell shared it as anything that violates the pre-fall order God established. And clearly mental health would fall into that bucket. And when we do justice, we know that it's evangelistic. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5:16 that when the people of God do good works, people see it and praise the Lord for it. And so we want to be involved in this because we want to reach people in New England with the good news of Jesus Christ. And so we're going to focus on one aspect of mental health today, and that's the concept of trauma. And trauma is something that people were already starting to talk about before COVID. I think it's going to be a broader issue for the church and believers as well as our communities. And so we'll talk more about that as we dig into what trauma is, what it looks like, and what the church can be doing about that. But to understand it, I'm pleased to have Dr. Karen Mason with us. Karen is a professor of counseling and psychology at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. She prepares students there to be licensed mental health counselors. She's been doing that since 2006. She also maintains a private practice. She's a licensed psychologist and a professional counselor. Prior to her time at Gordon-Conwell, she was out west where she would lead teams and high impact projects at the Mental Health Center of Denver. She managed the Office of Suicide Prevention at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. She's taught internationally on issues related to mental health. Her current research is focused on the clergy's and faith community's role in suicide prevention. She's a member of the Counseling Association and the American Psychological Association. That is a long, it's a very compressed resume, but that is a long resume, Karen. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Charles. And I just appreciate everything Vision New England is doing. So thanks for having me.
Thanks. God bless you. Well, let's start just by defining terms. What is trauma for us laymen?
Mm-hmm. Well, trauma has two parts to it. So the first part is a person is exposed to a sudden catastrophic event that involves either actual or threatened. It could be death or injury or violence, or it might be that the person witnesses someone else having that sudden catastrophic event occur to them, or they hear about a family member experiencing that, or they're involved in some way with the details of a catastrophic event. So certainly this worldwide pandemic qualifies as a sudden catastrophic event. And then the second part of the definition would be that there's some kind of emotional response to that. Now, one thing I'll say is that for most people, that emotional response is distress. And for instance, if you look back at 9/11, about 91% of people following 9/11 had some kind of response to that, just very sudden catastrophic event. So it's not unusual for people to, if they experience that first one, to experience that second part of the definition.
Okay, and so do we all experience that the same way then? Or are there, I don't know, is it wired up or experiential, or do some people experience it differently?
Mm-hmm. Right. So, it's very normal, as I said, for people to have that experience of distress after a traumatic event. But what is really interesting is that different people experience that distress differently, or they express it differently. So some people might just have a pervasive sense of fear or anxiety. Some people might just feel very kind of flat and disengaged. Some people might feel very keyed up and kind of hyper alert to what the next worst thing is going to be. Some people might dissociate. They just kind of walk around in a haze, or they might deny that the traumatic event happened, or some people might experience anger or irritability. So all people have that distress. Most people are going to experience distress, but how it gets expressed is different. And I think it really depends on sort of the severity of what happens, but also the resiliency that's inside of each person, just those strengths that are there.
And that's an interesting point. So what drives that resiliency? Are those learned behaviors and coping mechanisms, or just how we're wired up and God makes us different, or something else?
Well, I think, as a Christian, I think that those resiliencies are those strengths that God gives to each person. But the resiliencies can be very different for different people. So, for instance, some people might be very good at reaching out for help. Some people might have particular coping strategies that I know we want to talk about in a future question. But the other thing, so resiliency is something that's already there inside the person, that the person discovers inside themselves in the face of this traumatic event. Some people, though, have they experience what's called post-traumatic growth, which basically is a transformation that happens inside of a person as a result of that trauma. So for instance, just to give you an example, my brother was killed by a drunk driver when he was riding his bike, which is a traumatic event, and there's all kinds of grieving and experiences that, I and my whole family had. But one of the things that happened to me, I was in the smack dab middle of my PhD program, and I was starting to lose interest. And there was this transformation that happened inside of me. I can't, I want to make the most of what my brother never had. There was this transformation that happened, and I would call that an example of that post-traumatic growth, where for some people, and it doesn't happen in every, trauma situation, but for some people there might be that growth that happens, that different new perspective that emerges. And then some people, might get that distress that they feel might get worse. So some people, pull from their resilience, or they develop that new perspective, that post-traumatic growth. Some people, though, might get worse.
And so I'm trying to think how to say this. So people who know me would say I'm a very analytical person, unemotional. Now, more than the average person, so there's no such thing as unemotional. I'm sure you're going to tell me. But I've been called an android, a robot, right? All those kinds of things. Do you see those people as being more resilient because there's not as much of an emotional component to their response, or has that really got nothing to do with it?
Well, I bet there is an emotional component even for you, Charles. But there is such a thing as, people have different personalities, right? So you might be more of this kind of calm personality, whereas other people might be a little more reactive to the circumstances. So different people do have different personalities and are going to process that trauma differently. So that certainly could be part of what's going on, what you're describing there. But you know, one of the things that is very different here that affects how people experience trauma differently is for sure that those personality differences. It depends on sort of the perspectives that people bring to that traumatic event. One thing though is that severe traumas usually result in more severe effects. Even for people like you, I tend to be kind of that same kind of person who's fairly calm. But if it's severe enough, you are going to experience effects. So for instance, yeah, I tend to be that calm person, as I said, but you know, we lived in Haiti for 4 years where the political instability was just off the charts. And you know, I had a traumatic response to that. So if it's severe enough, people are going to have a more severe response to it. The other thing though is if the trauma tends to be repeated. So for instance, right now with the pandemic, we have surges and we have surges on top of surges. So there's a repetitive kind of effect to that. That adds up for people. So that can result in a more severe kind of response. Or if the person has previous trauma, they are going to respond a little bit differently. Or if there are severe losses that come with that trauma, like for instance, people losing their job or their financial viability. So it really depends on the picture of that particular trauma, and then how that person processes it. Like for instance, the culture, a person's cultural perspectives might influence how they process it. The other thing is that we were talking about resiliency and post-traumatic growth, but it also depends on the kind of social support that people have. So people who have gone through this pandemic all by themselves, that has been a challenge for some folks.
Yeah. And so when you talk about culture, tell me what you mean by that. How does that impact our ability?
Yes. Well, first of all, different cultures are going to pull for different kinds of strengths, right? So different cultures might have different kind of traditions around what to do in those particular situations. Like, how do you pull together? You know, what are the ways in which a culture pulls together? Cultures can also influence, again, it's the perspectives that we have on what's happening. Like, is it allowable, right? Does our family of origin, which often is a mechanism for culture, does our family of origin tell us how to respond emotionally to these sudden traumatic events? Does it give us kind of a template for where to go? So, so cultures can influence the personal response, but also the community response.
Interesting. So let me see if I'm hearing that right. You're making me think of a conversation I had with Celestine Musakara years ago when he was visiting our church. And he does, for folks who may not know him, he does reconciliation work in Africa. And he was sharing how I forget what country he was going into, but he was sneaking into this country where he wasn't allowed to be preaching the gospel. And he's been arrested a couple of times, if I remember the details right. It was a long time ago. And I said, well, you know, what happens if they catch you again? And he's like, oh, they'll just beat me. And so to me, I think if they beat me, that's a traumatic response because you're not allowed to do that here.
Yes, right.
But for him, it was more of a normal thing. No, they'll just beat me. And it didn't sound like it was going to be a traumatic thing for him. Is that what we mean by culture playing a role?
It can be culture. It could also be a kind of desensitization for him also. So he's been through this before and he has understood that he survives it.
Yeah.
So it could be a different kinds of things in addition to culture.
And so what I'm hearing is folks will experience this. We could have the same experience, and we may react to it differently. And that reaction range can be from growth to debilitating problems to maybe not even recognizing that that this was a problem, we just moved past it.
Yeah.
And that will have to do with upbringing, culture, prior experiences, how you're wired up. And so it's not a simple thing to say, hey, this happened and now we're going to deal with trauma.
Right.
And the same event can be more traumatic for different people because they experience it differently. I think about the contrast in COVID of some people just worked from home.
Yeah.
And didn't have to worry about kids in school and stuff like that, or no lost income. And so this wasn't, it's an inconvenience.
Mm-hmm.
To the extreme end of, no, I'm trying, one of us lost our job. We're trying to juggle kids at home. My parents are in an elder care facility. Nobody can see them. We've lost family members, church members, friends. And so the same thing of just COVID is going to play out very differently too.
Absolutely. Yeah, you did a wonderful job of rephrasing that and summarizing it. That's absolutely.
Well, I always like to see if I'm hearing it because I can miss stuff pretty easily.
No, you got it.
And so is there a level of trauma
Mm-hmm.
that is, hey, this is just normal what people deal with every day, versus when it becomes that debilitating thing? I remember a friend who worked for a pharmaceutical company explaining that OCD isn't a problem until it takes, I forget, like 2 hours of your day. And now it's a diagnosable problem you need to do something about. But a little bit of OCD is okay, which I took great comfort in, by the way.
You have those tendencies.
Does trauma work the same way? Is there a level which, oh, it's okay, and then a level which, no, needs to be treated with expertise?
Mm-hmm. Right. So every mental health condition like OCD or other kind of trauma reactions, which I'll explain in a second, the threshold that you want to pay attention to is, does it get in the way of either your functioning socially or you're functioning occupationally and educationally? So just let me give you an example. So, most people are going to have a distress reaction to trauma, right? To these sudden catastrophic events. Most people are going to experience distress. But for some people, it's going to make them so distressed that maybe they become irritable and they end up not being able to function in their family anymore. All right, that's a social effect. Or it might make them so distressed that they're not able to concentrate on either, participating in school or participating in their job. So once it crosses that threshold, and I like that 2 hour idea, because basically they're saying it crosses a threshold where there's an impairment. It gets in the way of how you're functioning.
Okay.
So when it comes to trauma, most people are going to have a reaction of either distress or disorganization after, a sudden catastrophic event. But what happens is that if that continues, for a whole month, then there is a diagnosable condition called acute stress disorder. Now, a lot of people experience acute stress disorder, and that resolves within that month or 2 or 3 or whatever. But for some people, about half the people who experience these very sudden catastrophic events, it will move into what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. All right, so what differentiates that is how long those distress symptoms last.
Okay.
So depending on how long those last, that's what's going to help you know whether there's a threshold that has been crossed. So, if those symptoms are starting to get worse, and I can give you more information about what I mean by symptoms. I realized I just used a mental health word there, but if those tend to get worse, and if they last over a long period of time, and of course, by the way, with the pandemic, we're getting re-traumatized every time there's a new surge. So we also have to keep that in mind, that there's kind of new sudden catastrophic events that are re-happening to all of us with these surges and surges on top of surges. But what you want to think about is, after each one of those traumatic events, are those symptoms resolving, or are they continuing? Are they getting worse? And what you're looking for is things like, you just can't get the thought of this out of your mind, or that it's showing up in dreams or flashbacks, right? Or you just can't experience positive feelings anymore, like love and happiness, or you're kind of walking around in a daze, or you're trying hard not to re-experience these thoughts of the pandemic, but you just can't get rid of them. And it results in just being kind of hyper alert, and it's affecting your sleep, and you can't concentrate, and you're more irritable, and you're hyper vigilantly looking for the next shoe to drop, and you have what's called an exaggerated startle response. So I'll give you an example of that. So I remember coming back from Haiti and eating the 4th of July picnic with my parents, and hearing firecrackers and diving under the table. That's an exaggerated startle response. So having those kinds of symptoms, so again, I'm using a mental health word here, but having those kinds of reactions to those sudden traumatic events that last over a longer period of time than 1 month, 3 months, that's when you're saying to yourself, maybe this is something I should seek help for.
And so you're triggering a response in me in that you're reminding me there was a time when we would come together on July 4th and we would eat meals together.
Right.
I've forgotten that.
I know, who does that anymore, right? We didn't.
And so is a reaction, is that a triggering, trigger gets a political term, and I don't want to go anywhere near that, but is that a triggering event then? Is that what we mean by it, that it brings it back?
Right. So it could be, so for instance, just watching the news nowadays can be, as you're calling it, a trigger event. So it reminds us about, maybe our sense of lack of safety, our sense of lack of predictability. All of those things, those feelings get triggered, and we're having to deal with them all over again. And that's the distress related to the pandemic. If that gets worse, that's where it crosses the threshold.
And so you've shared some of what trauma would look like, how it plays out in me. And so I'm hearing those as maybe like warning signs. If I'm experiencing the loss of love, loss of enjoyment, that should let me know, hey, there's something going on here that's more than I realize. Right. And are there other things that I can identify in myself that should be raising a flag? Or how do I watch? Because I don't know how to know if somebody can't love anymore. How do I spot those things in others who may be needing help?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And by the way, what you're looking for is having those last over periods of time, because all of us are going to have some experiences of this. So for instance, let me just say, it's fairly well established that all of us are experiencing what's called pandemic brain fog. We have a lessened ability to just process complicated things during this pandemic. And why is that? Because in the back of our brain, we're processing, hey, am I safe? Are my family members safe? We've got that little bit of chatter activity going on in the back of our minds. And so all of us are dealing with this, and so occasionally we're all going to engage in some of these things. But what we're looking for is a pattern over some time here. But here might be something. So if somebody makes a statement that just seems inaccurate, and this is a pattern over time, that might be something to look for. So for instance, somebody who says, I've always had bad judgment. I shouldn't have gone to that event where I caught COVID and gave it to my grandfather. Mm-hmm. Well, the likelihood that this person always has bad judgment is pretty low. Right? So those kinds of inaccurate statements. I would start to pay attention to that. Somebody who has stopped engaging in their hobbies. Now, most of us have during the pandemic, but at the same time, if there's nothing positive in that person's life, that might be something worth paying attention to. If they walk around with a persistent fear or persistent anger or persistent guilt, again, you're looking for that pattern over time. If they have more irritability, if they engage in reckless behaviors like too much alcohol use, if they're looking always for the next threat, if they're jumpy and they have that startle response like I was describing about myself, if they, and again, we're all going to have difficulty paying attention to conversations or even remembering our own phone number because of this pandemic brain fog. But if that's a pattern over time, if they have difficulty sleeping because of nightmares or just being afraid, those are things that we want to pay attention to. And again, all of us are going to experience some of those things occasionally, but the pattern is what you're looking for.
And so, and you've highlighted, you implied something else that's important, I think, for people to hear, because I was reading something the other day that made this point to me, is get a hobby, right? Because you talk about stopping hobbies. We don't have hobbies anymore. People used to collect stamps and coin, right? We don't do that anymore. Instead, we sit on social media, which by based on what you're talking about, I think may be traumatic for people.
It can be re-traumatizing.
Yeah.
Yeah. To just keep getting that news that just reinforces that sense of, oh no, I'm not safe.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we're seeing these signs in ourselves or we're seeing them in others, what should we be doing?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things, again, if it's a pattern over time, thinking about referring that person or encouraging that person or supporting that person to reach out for help to a mental health professional is not a bad thing. But as a church leader, there are so many things that we can do. So one of the things is, catastrophes tend to bring up our sense of lack of control, right? Now, the truth is we don't have a lot of control in this world, but good thing God is in control.
COVID has drawn the curtain back on the illusion.
That's right, exactly. But at the same time, we do need to go through life with that sense of, there are some things I can control at least, And so helping the traumatized person really get that sense of control back. And sometimes it's just, what's the next thing you want to do for today? So as a church leader, you could ask a traumatized person, what's just one thing you want to do today? And just to help that person regain that sense of control, it might be just register the kids for school in the spring. Just that one thing. What's that one thing you can do? The other thing is that to keep in mind is that routine helps people have a sense of safety. So figuring out what is that daily routine that could be helpful for this person. So for instance, instead of staying in bed all day or sitting on your couch watching TV all day or sitting on your phone doing social media all day, what's a routine that you could put in place that just helps you gain a sense of control and a sense of safety in what really feels like an out of control, unsafe world. And then the last thing I'll just say is just giving someone a chance to talk. And it doesn't have to be about the catastrophic event. It can just be getting a sense of connection with another human being. I think sometimes that's just so important.
Which is hugely missing today.
Yes.
Right? Alone can often lead to loneliness, and there's a lot of alone today with people.
That's right. Just giving someone a place to talk can be helpful. Now, the other thing I'll just mention, just to tack on, is that there's a whole approach to what to do or how to help people after a disaster like, for instance, the California wildfires or some of the flooding that happens after hurricanes hit the Gulf Coast. And that's called psychological first aid. So when we talk about resources in a few questions down the road here, I can mention psychological first aid, which is something that some churches have gotten involved in.
So let me say something, but it's really a question. Before I was in ministry, full-time vocational ministry, I was in the corporate world for years, and I built a technology center down in New Orleans in the years after Katrina. And I remember a lot of dialogue around trauma, because what was happening there, New Orleans became the per capita murder capital of the country.
Yeah.
And none of the policing tactics that had worked to reduce crime elsewhere were working there. And I remember an interview where the police chief said, because what's happening here is, I walk out one morning and I see you parked in front of my house again and I shot you.
Yeah.
And he said, you can't police for that. And they traced it all back to, that was hangover for several years of trauma related to Katrina, where folks were up to here with, I lost my job, I lost my home, I lost my family, right? And trying to just rebuild, and just one little thing sets you off. And so if they're right that that's trauma, does that mean we're going to see that stuff start to play out as COVID progresses and we get out of COVID, because so many more people are traumatized? Are we going to see those kinds of things playing out?
Well, again, just going back to what we talked about earlier, I think it really depends on, how people are processing this. Is there a way to be able to provide a whole nation with a sense of safety and predictability and that sort of thing? So for instance, maybe with the advent of the vaccine, it might be different from a one-time, although Katrina was a very protracted over many days, but at the same time, it was more of a natural disaster. COVID has a much longer trajectory. So this is going to be, people are going to process this a little bit differently. And it depends, I think, on how we as a society, but also how our churches pull together and come around people who really need that support, because there are protective aspects to that social support.
And so when you were talking about coping mechanisms before, I heard a little bit, just give yourself, bring back the illusion of control, if you will. And so I liken that to, right, the times I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm stressed about something, and all I need to do is get it on a piece of paper. And so I make tasks, I'm a list maker, make task lists, organize them, categorize them, color code them, right, do whatever, right? And suddenly the stress is gone, because I feel like I've got control over it because it's on a piece of paper. For some people in some circumstances, is it that simple?
So there are a few things that I would say to that. And I think helping people regain that sense of control is really important. And just finding that next thing that you can take control of, which could be just, getting the laundry done, or helping the person take their laundry to a laundromat and getting their laundry done. So it can be something just like whatever is the next thing is that change what you can change, take control of what you can take control of. Now, there are all kinds of things that we can't take control of at the same time. So the next piece we were mentioning is just that sense of developing routine for people, helping people develop routines. And so some of the routines I think that are really important that are part of coping is exercise, just getting some kind of movement. So for sure, not staying in bed, not sitting on the couch all day. But even if it's just walking to the mailbox to get the mail once a day, but if you can do more than that, just walk around the block once a day. So some form of exercise, because that movement of the body is going to strengthen the soul. Eating nourishing food as opposed to sitting on the couch eating candy, right? Or non-nourishing food. Taking your prescribed medication. So taking care of yourself in that way. The other thing I'll say about that routine piece that's so important is trying as much as possible to get back to sleeping 8 hours a day, because these catastrophic events do wake us up in the middle of the night. And what gets disrupted is our sleep. So figuring out how to get back to a sleep routine is part of helping people gain a sense of control over what feels really out of control for them, which is that they can't get themselves to sleep. So there's a lot of information on the internet about what's called sleep hygiene. I often tell people, just choose one thing on that list and try it. So going to bed at the same time and getting up at the same time every day. Doing something quiet before you go to sleep, like do not watch the news, right? That's important. Also not drinking caffeine after noon or whatever time it is that, yeah, exactly. You get up to this point in time, and then after that you should stop consuming caffeine, and that includes chocolate, by the way, or caffeinated drinks. But the other piece that I think is important as Christians is working on what I call a nighttime prayer routine. So, so for instance, I think it's really important. I think it can be helpful for Christians to give their pain and their suffering to God. Let him carry it overnight so that you yourself can get sleep. And, in some traditions, liturgical traditions, they'll call this compline, but there are many examples of this. And I think it's so important for the person to really come up with a prayer that really speaks to them and helps them really reflect on God's love and care for them and God's sovereignty even while they're asleep. So I'll just give you one example. This comes from a book called More Than an Aspirin, about how people manage suffering. But this is an example of a nighttime prayer. This day is over. I stop. I shut the door. This night I will not work at grief or pain or worry or problem solving. This night I will take Sabbath from my work and from my pain. I will rest in God's protective presence and his faithfulness. And in obedience, I will leave tomorrow's work and worry for tomorrow. I just think that's a powerful routine that can be helpful for people to really try to get back to that sleep routine.
I have a pastor friend who talks about the spiritual discipline of gratitude.
There you go.
Right. And it sounds like, and so that implies that, hey, there may be an aspect of helping somebody work through this that does relate to a healthy spiritual life, just like a healthy physical life and healthy spiritual life. So what, though, would you say to the person who would say, hey, actually something is wrong with your spiritual life or you wouldn't have this problem?
Yes, exactly. So definitely want to talk about that. And I do think, just I'll say this before I turn to that second question. I do think that helping people understand where God is in this catastrophic event is part of what people need to do, part of coping on some level. It's more than coping, because it has to do with situating yourself, within the sovereignty of God and within the love of God. But I think that is so important. But let me address your question there, and I'm going to just take on this notion of what I think the church can do.
Perfect.
People in these situations of great suffering. So one of the first things I just want to say is, there's nobody else in the world who's better positioned to help people understand why suffering happens to good people, right? To Christians. Now, many Christians believe that God won't let bad things happen to the righteous, or that only weak Christians or sinful Christians experience suffering. The book of Job disproves that forever.
Yeah.
The other thing is that in 1 Peter 4, the Apostle Peter writes to us and says, look, don't be surprised at the painful things that you're suffering. Christians do suffer, and Christians who are righteous, like Job, suffer. So I think one of the most important things we need to do as a church in the context of this pandemic is really understand why that can happen, why suffering can happen to Christians. And there's a way where, when we're in the midst of suffering, we really turn inwards, right? Instead of being outwardly focused, we're really focused on our own suffering. And so we're asking, why me? And I think the church needs to help people think about, why does God allow evil? Why doesn't he restrict it more? Why is it happening to me? Is suffering an evidence of God having abandoned me? Is God's love for me really enough to help me withstand the suffering that I'm experiencing in my heart?
And the answering is something along the lines of, where were you when I hung the stars?
Yes, exactly. Right, exactly. To repeat
not to make light of it, but there's that aspect that God, that's how God answers Job, right?
There's a mystery in suffering, is what I think, that's how I read Job. And so one of the things I think the church needs to do is help people answer some of those questions, which of course are somewhat unanswerable. It's just what you were saying, Charles. The other thing, though, is teaching Christians how to suffer. So, for instance, we practice the presence of joy. We practice the presence of God. We remain open to joy, as Habakkuk said. We, in fact, nurture hope, as Jeremiah did in the face of the destruction of Jerusalem. We pray, we don't give up, even when God seems to be hiding himself, which is what the psalmist tells us to do, right? We pray psalms of lament. We reach out for support, as blind Bartimaeus did. So I think we have to have answers for people around why good people suffer. We have to help Christians figure out how to suffer. We also need to figure out how to come alongside people who are suffering. How do we mourn with people who are mourning? How do we not engage in platitudes, which are the easy answers that ignore the pain and the suffering that people have? So just saying, well, it must be God's will. That's a platitude. It doesn't recognize the incredible suffering that people have. It's not mourning with people who are mourning.
I would so tell me if I was helpful or not, but I would tell my Sunday school class two things when we would talk about suffering. One was, I have yet to hear a Christian say, things were going so well, we're making money, the house was just right, everything was good with the kids, my career was progressing, everything in church, and I just grew so much in the Lord during that time.
Yes.
Right. It's always the opposite. It was always the suffering and the pain. And I grew, and I've got a friend who went through a debilitating bout of depression. I remember him saying, I hated it. I never wanted to go through it again. And I'm glad I went through it.
Well, there you go. And, I have to say, Charles, to me, that sounds like post-traumatic growth. I just think, God, C.S. Lewis says God speaks to us like a megaphone in our pain and our suffering. Mm-hmm. I think we need to, develop what's called a theodicy, an understanding about a theological understanding of why pain and suffering occurs. We need to teach Christians how to suffer. We need to teach Christians how to come alongside others in their suffering. But we also need to understand that about 25% of people will come to clergy and faith leaders for help, not to people like me, mental health professionals. So I think we also just have to be ready.
And so if I'm a pastor who somebody comes to me, or I'm a friend who somebody comes to me, what should I do that can be helpful, and maybe what should I not do that could be harmful? Right? You mentioned platitudes. Help us curb our tongues a little bit, maybe. Mm-hmm. What's helpful and what's harmful?
Well, I think that sometimes people just need physical help with things that maybe through wildfire have been destroyed, right? People have lost access to shelter and food. So really trying to understand what are those very specific needs for, just to go back to what we were saying, that sense of control, that sense of safety, that sense of being able to live a life with food and with shelter, that sense of routine. So just also just being present, being willing to be there, not necessarily processing the trauma, but being a person who's there, who is willing to connect in a compassionate way with this person so that they don't feel that sense of aloneness. I'm facing this horrible traumatic event all by myself. So, coming alongside, being that person who listens, who helps take care of those immediate needs, that projects that calm and that compassion, that connects them up with the resources that they need, connects them up with their social support system. We were talking about how that's very protective. So all of those things are aspects that can be helpful. So you wouldn't want to say go and be well, right, and not in fact help them with the immediate physical needs.
Which sounds like, I mean, some of what you're talking about, clearly some people need real training, but what I hear you saying is some of this, just take care of their physical needs and love them. And that may not mean I give you advice and counsel, because that may not be helpful at all. It may be a little bit more like, I think about when we've talked about in church settings about what we should be doing at a hospital visit or something like that, is sometimes just be there.
Just the ministry of presence.
Yeah, just be there, touch a hand, hold a hand, and you can't make it go away with words, so don't try.
That's right, absolutely. So just being present, in the midst of this just traumatic event, and helping them with those specific needs. And I'm thinking about, the passage in Matthew about the sheep and the goats, right? That you want to provide for those physical.
And James speaks to the same thing, right? What good is it to be warm and well fed, as you said, right?
That's
be warm
right.
and well fed, now get on with my life,
yeah,
right?
Bye.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and all of that is part of that psychological first aid that I was talking about. And so two of the resources that I'll mention in a little bit are, I'm going to provide two resources on psychological first aid, one from the World Health Organization and one also from the National, let me get that right in front of me, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the National Center for PTSD. So there are two resources on how to do psychological first aid in church settings.
And for folks looking for that, Bob is our producer, is popping them into the Facebook Live feed. You can find the links there, or just drop a note to Vision New England. We're happy to provide that stuff to you. And so those are some resources. One thing, and this struck me as you were saying, is, so how do I find, mental health is not an easy thing to talk about in the church. Sometimes because the church can be a little dysfunctional on it at times. And I think this is changing in some of the churches we work with, at least, where we recognize spiritual components can be a part of what's going on with someone's mental health, but they're not the only thing necessarily. And there can be physical, medical, chemical things that are happening too. So it's hard to talk about in a church environment sometimes. How do I find them? If I'm listening and I know someone, or I feel like I actually need to talk to someone, how do I find that person?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the best ways is to kind of put out your feelers. And I know that this is difficult because of, as you're talking about, Charles, there is a stigma. We do tend to over-spiritualize mental health conditions and say, okay, it just reflects on, some kind of spiritual weakness, which is not the case, as you're saying. So it's hard to reach out sometimes, but hopefully there would be people in your network who are who can give you some word of mouth referrals and suggestions of where to go. So when I've talked to pastors about how do they develop that list, because every pastor wants to have that list. Yeah. How do they do that? And for the most part, they talk to other pastors in their area and try to develop a list based on that network. The other thing that I can do is that at Gordon-Conwell, we keep a list of Christian practitioners in the greater Boston area, and I can certainly send that to you and Bob if you would like to make that available.
That'd be great.
And there are a number of just very wonderful Christian counseling centers in the Boston area, and so those would be on the list.
And we know of at least a couple in some other areas, but also I've had referred to me by a couple of pastors, some online, to do telehealth basically. So if somebody can't find it through their network, reach out to us and we'll see what we can do to try and help with that too.
There you go. And I was going to say most practitioners right now are in fact providing telehealth. So
because I always think of, just because of some family experiences we've had, is you can find a therapist who's really helpful. And I have a therapist sister-in-law and she's really helpful. Of course, how could she not be? But I also know of some experience in our family where the worldview of the therapist is so different, it actually wasn't helpful. And so that's the thing that I think about how to find it. And it sounds like the starting point is your pastor, because they'll all have at least a starting point of a Christian counselor, or at least typically that's been my experience.
Yeah, most pastors are in the position, as I said, of whenever they come to a new area, of trying to develop that list of resources.
Karen, as our time winds down, what have I not been smart enough to ask you about that you think people need to know?
Well, you've totally been smart enough to ask me everything I could think of, but because you're asking me that question, I buckled down to try to think of what else I could say. So I'll add two thoughts. One of them is that in most disasters, there tend to be different phases. So at first there's this heroic phase where we're all, trying to supply the needs of people who are really affected by the disaster. And then the honeymoon phase where we continue to reach out compassionately. But then there's the disillusionment phase where there's less resources and less attention given to people who are impacted. I think that in this pandemic, we might be more in that disillusionment phase. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is just how can we persevere in doing these good works for people, coming alongside people. And sort of the related piece I wanted to share is that helpers can be subject to what would be called secondary trauma, where we actually get traumatized by hearing these stories over and over, or we develop compassion fatigue where we really start not caring anymore. And so one of the things I just would like to emphasize is that none of us are exempt from the fourth commandment, right? All of us need to remember that Sabbath day. Even if it's not Sunday, we need to remember that there's a regular rhythm, that we work and then we take rest for ourselves. And so if you find yourself either in that position of secondary trauma or compassion fatigue, reach out for help for yourself. Or another thing that I think is so important is just to remember that because of that pandemic brain fog, I think all of us have to think about how much work can we do? Not what other people do, but how much work can we do? And not to do more than that.
It's a great point. It's a common conversation we have on the Black Ministerial Alliance of Greater Boston, now BMA 10 Points. We have a conversation. That's been a really big conversation lately as pastors burn out because it's just been stressful. And so many of them are having congregant trauma played out with them.
Yes.
And so I've had a number of pastors share how a congregant who been here for 10 years, backbone kind of guy, thought they were really faithful, and blew up at me because I didn't wear a tie one Sunday, or blew up at me because I talked about wearing masks, or blew up at me because I didn't talk about wearing masks, and which I, just because my Katrina lens, I hear that as maybe trauma, and then we can escalate that trauma, or we can try and de-escalate the trauma. And that requires, though, a different set of eyes and ears to understand what might be going on in front of us.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, very true. Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to share?
I think you have asked me some wonderful questions, Charles. I think you've just asked me everything that I wanted to share about trauma.
Oh, great. Thanks. I appreciate it. Well, there's a lot more questions I wanted to ask, but we're already over our time. So would love to continue this dialogue at some point. So Karen, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for letting us learn from your expertise. And I'm confident. We believe that when God's people are confronted with the problems of the church and the community, God calls and convicts people. And so I think there's a piece of this that will help with that. And that if churches can start to help their own people with topics like trauma, and if we can figure out how to help our communities, that will be evangelistic, and people will glorify God because of what God's people do. And so thank you for helping us with that. Thank you for educating us. And thank you to our audience. I hope this was a helpful one to you. Thank you to Bob Atherton, our producer, who makes all of this ministry possible. Our next podcast is December 19th. And I keep saying every time I do say, we're going to do something a little different. I think everyone is a little different, so I need to stop saying it. But we're going to have Bishop Larry Ward from Abundant Life Church in Cambridge and Pastor Chris Gepner from Riverbank Church up in White River Junction, Vermont. And we're going to be talking about what their churches do at Christmas normally, and maybe how that's going to look a little different this year, and how Christmas becomes evangelistic from a church perspective. So join us for that. Karen, thanks again for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Charles. I appreciate the opportunity.